Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're tackling one of the most profound, highest-stakes questions within our entire justice system. Think about it. When a life is literally on the line, how exactly does the law define an act of pure evil? We kind of tend to think of the law as this set of rigid, objective rules, right? But when it comes to capital punishment, the legal system has to grapple with human depravity, and that is incredibly difficult to quantify. So in this explainer, we're going to unpack the legal framework behind the death penalty. We'll be focusing specifically on a highly controversial standard used in Florida to weigh the gravity of a capital crime. We're going to look at the history, some truly heartbreaking case studies, and the urgent push for a scientific solution to standardize exactly how we measure the darkest corners of human behavior. Let's get into it.
To really understand how the system attempts to categorize the worst of the worst, we have to look at the specific language the courts are using. Just listen to this chilling definition from Justice Adkins back in the 1973 case State v. Dixon. He outlines Florida's heinous, atrocious, or cruel standard. In legal circles, this is commonly referred to as the hack standard. Notice the intensely subjective nature of these words here. Extremely wicked, shockingly evil, outrageously wicked and vile. You know, as an explainer of complex topics, I'm always looking for objective metrics, but here we are met with highly emotional, deeply subjective adjectives. And this is the exact language judges are forced to rely on when deciding if a criminal crosses that ultimate line from getting life in prison to receiving the death penalty.
The legal fallout.
So how in the world did the justice system end up relying on such ambiguous terminology for a final, irreversible punishment? Well, to understand that, we need to trace the legal fallout that forced Florida, and honestly the rest of the country, to completely rebuild its life and death rules from the ground up. The modern era of capital punishment essentially started in 1972. The U.S. Supreme Court made a landmark decision in Furman v. Georgia, striking down existing death penalty statutes. Why? Because they were being applied completely arbitrarily. Handing out death sentences was basically like a terrifying roll of the dice, which violated the Eighth Amendment's ban on cruel and unusual punishment. Naturally, states scrambled to rewrite their laws. By 1976, the court heard Profit v. Florida and actually upheld Florida's brand new, highly structured, hybrid sentencing scheme. But the legal battles definitely didn't stop there. In 1984, Spaziano v. Florida upheld a really controversial rule allowing a judge to completely override a jury's recommendation. The pendulum finally swung back a bit in 2002 with Ring v. Arizona, where the Supreme Court ruled that a jury, not just a judge, must make the findings of fact necessary to impose a death sentence. It's a timeline that tracks a messy evolution from an arbitrary system to a strictly structured yet deeply complex legal process.
Section 2. Florida's hybrid sentencing. That brings us specifically to the system Florida built in the wake of that 1972 Furman decision. It's this controversial trifurcated mechanism designed to carefully weigh the true severity of a capital crime. The crucial point here is understanding how this hybrid system actually operates in the real world. Once a defendant is convicted of a capital felony, there's a whole separate sentencing trial. On one side, we have the advisory jury. They hear the evidence, consider the nature of the crime, and provide an advisory recommendation: life imprisonment or death. But, and this is a massive but, the ultimate power has historically rested with the trial judge. The judge has to independently weigh aggravating circumstances, the factors that make the crime worse, against mitigating circumstances, which are factors that might warrant leniency. If the judge decides the aggravators outweigh the mitigators, they can impose the death penalty. This exact dynamic led to the highly controversial jury override we just talked about, where a judge could theoretically sentence a person to death even if the jury recommended life, as long as the facts were so clear that no reasonable person could differ.
Section 3. Heinous, atrocious, or cruel.
Now that we understand the machinery of the sentencing process, we really need to drill down into the specific, deeply ambiguous, aggravating factor that brings us to the very core of this explainer: the heinous, atrocious, or cruel standard. HAC. It's just one of several statutory aggravators listed in Florida law, but let me tell you, it is considered one of the absolute most weighty in the sentencing calculus. It's meant to apply to conscientious or pitiless crimes that are unnecessarily torturous to the victim. But the fatal flaw of the HAC standard? It entirely lacks a clear, objective scientific foundation. Because there's no standardized definition of what constitutes heinous, it creates just massive subjective confusion for judges and juries trying to quantify human suffering. In fact, judges have openly noted that this factor has been applied so broadly over the years that it literally causes anomalous, inconsistent results. One judge's definition of pitiless might be completely different from another's.
Section 4. Case studies.
recognizing evil.
Okay, to truly grasp the weight of this legal ambiguity, we need to step away from the sterile legal theory of the Supreme Court and apply this standard to visceral, harrowing true crime realities. Fair warning, the facts of these cases are deeply disturbing, but they are absolutely essential to understanding how the justice system attempts to recognize true evil. Let's look at the 2007 case of Richard Allen Johnson. Johnson spent the night with his victim after meeting her at a bar, and the following day, after an argument, he killed her. He strangled her both manually with his bare hands and with a ligature. But what sets this apart, what the courts look at when determining the HAC standard, is the chilling testimony given at trial where Johnson actually noted that it took longer to break his victim's neck than he thought it would. In this scenario, the trial judge found that the murder was carried out in a heinous, atrocious, or cruel manner, and the Supreme Court of Florida definitively upheld that aggravator, affirming his death sentence.
Then we have the 2003 case of Harry Butler. Butler entered the home of his ex-girlfriend, Leslie Fleming. Their young daughter was actually in the bedroom with Fleming at the time. Butler deliberately picked his daughter up, moved her into a separate room, and then returned to Fleming. He proceeded to stab her multiple times and then strangle her. The premeditated brutality of moving the child before executing the violent act, that spoke volumes to the court. During sentencing, the judge found only one aggravating circumstance present, that the murder was heinous, atrocious, or cruel. Even though several mitigating circumstances were found in Butler's favor, the sheer weight of that single HAC aggravator was enough. His death sentence was upheld. It just goes to show that sometimes a single instance of extreme cruelty is enough to seal a defendant's fate.
And perhaps most disturbing is the calculated 2006 case of William Code. Code had an on-again, off-again relationship with his ex-girlfriend Gloria Gomez. After they broke up, he lured her to his apartment using a devastating, manipulative lie. He falsely claimed he had cancer. When she arrived and refused his attempts to reconcile, he flew into a violent rage. This case highlights the stark, terrifying gap between neat legal definitions and the chaotic, brutal reality of a crime scene.
I just want you to imagine this number, 144. That is the horrifying number of total wounds inflicted on Gloria Gomez. Code struck her with a hammer 57 times. He then stabbed her with a knife 87 times. Expert medical testimony revealed that Gomez was likely conscious for 143 of those 144 wounds. It is emotionally arresting, and it forces absolutely anyone observing the case to immediately validate the presence of the heinous, atrocious, or cruel standard. There's just no denying it here.
And the details get even darker. In his own written confession, Kodai admitted that Gomez was alive until the final fatal stab wound, when he thrust the knife into her neck and basically just held it there until she expired. The Supreme Court of Florida firmly rejected Kodai's argument that he didn't intend to inflict pain, stating that his actions demonstrated an utter indifference to her suffering. His calculated actions perfectly and tragically matched the legal definition of cruel.
Section 5. The search for standards.
Now, these past cases represent instances where the courts overwhelmingly agreed that the hack standard was met. But what happens when the lines of evil are blurred? What happens when one judge sees a crime as a standard murder while another sees it as outrageously vile? Relying on subjective guesswork is quite frankly dangerous when lives are on the line. Which brings us to a proposed scientific solution, the depravity scale. This is a fascinating collaborative initiative aiming to provide an objective, nationwide method of defining heinous crimes, basically giving judges the specific guidance they desperately need for standards like Florida's HAC. Crucially, the research for the depravity scale is divided into 3 distinct phases. Phase 1 focuses on historical case reviews to identify specific elements of depravity. Phase 2 involves surveys of criminal justice professionals to see exactly how they weigh these elements. And finally, Phase 3 extends these surveys to the general public to establish a real societal consensus on what makes a crime truly depraved. By categorizing evil scientifically, it hopes to finally replace emotion with standardized clarity. Which brings us to the end of our explainer. But we are left with a lingering, provocative question. If a single judge's personal interpretation of words like wicked or evil can dictate whether a human being lives or dies, can our justice system ever truly standardize depravity? Can science completely replace the human element when measuring the darkest depths of a crime? It's a terrifying moral ambiguity that sits at the very heart of capital sentencing. Thank you for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning the systems around you, and we'll see you next time.